Succession is HBO's critically acclaimed drama about the brutal power struggles between an iron-fisted media magnate and his ambitious and damaged offspring. It's an entrancing mix of searing dialogue, ruthless backstabbing, and intense career-defining performances. I'm Rob Licuria, senior editor here at Gold Derby, and I'm here with leading man Jeremy Strong, who plays potential successor Kendall Roy. Now, Jeremy, it's difficult to encapsulate who this guy is in simple terms. To me, he's very complicated, but you're probably best placed to give it a go. So how do you describe him to people who aren't quite familiar with the character?
Here we go. I sort of don't. I try not to describe him or sort of step outside of him, because I guess I feel like my job is to almost as much as possible completely identify with and embody him, and so in a way I don't have any objectivity from the outside. That being said, I think one of the great virtues and strengths of Jesse's incredibly sort of, as you say, complex and sort of agile writing is that it defies categorization. These characters are never a sort of binary of one thing or the other. What I love about his writing is that it exists in a sort of place of of ambiguity and in that gray area, especially living in a time where the marketplace is so saturated with stories about superheroes. Jesse is sort of existing in a post-heroic world where there are no heroes or anti-heroes, but people who are, I think, just fundamentally struggling and grappling and in the thicket of themselves. And, I was thinking about this time that we're all living through right now, and that I think it's a Paul McCartney song, sort of, I'm just a man in the middle of something that I don't understand. That kind of level of opacity and being kind of lost in the middle of something and through a glass darkly is kind of how I experience Kendall. I'm very in touch with what he needs and in a sense what drives him, what he's propelled by and what he needs and cares about. And then I sort of enter the arena and allow that sort of propulsion to kind of make me collide with whatever's happening. But certainly Kendall is, it's Jesse sort of writing the shadow self in a way. So Kendall has his ambitions and he has his addiction and he has his demons. And so I think my job as an actor is to try and really enter into and inhabit that place, and so it's I hope that's a somewhat of an answer. It's a hard thing to quantify, I guess, because what you want it to be is on the vine. You want it to be a living thing, and just as it would be so hard for you or I to describe ourselves in some in some precise way.
Yeah, and yet I guess we could pinpoint a few parts of his personality, and we can look back at some of your highlights from the first two seasons. But for example, he's obviously very ambitious. He has a need for power, control, recognition. I'm not quite sure how to pinpoint that. What do you think about desperation in him? What drives that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, there was I think it's a British poem by, I'm going to forget. I think the poet's name is Stevie Smith, called Not Waving But Drowning. And it's this idea of a person who essentially is perceived as waving, but in their desperation but they're in fact drowning, and in their desperation, it looks like they're waving. And I think Kendall often feels like he's waving. And there is as you've seen, a sort of bravura performance of the kind of person that he wants to be, the kind of alpha, kind of, like his father, a sort of primal force, the way that his father is this, dominating, formidable force of nature. Kendall, I think, I read a quote before we started the pilot that was something that Carl Jung had said, that where love is absent, power fills the vacuum. And I've talked about that before, but I only have so many, touchstones really that I work with on this, and that's really been one of the central kind of pillars for me, trying to understand that. I think there is a great desire to prove himself and to gain validation and acceptance. I also think there's something about Kendall which I feel a great deal of empathy for and can understand. He's someone who often tries too hard. Yeah. He sort of overshoots the mark, and it's painful. It's painful to experience, and I imagine it's painful to see. You're in Australia. One of the, of course, the Murdochs are a sort of one of the archetypes that have probably informed the thinking of the show, while the show is about the Roys. And at this point, I think the Roys have become their own dynastic family. But I remember reading in one of Michael Wolff's books that James had a habit of tying his shoelaces very tightly. And there was a sort of element, there was just something about that in a visceral way, whether that's apocryphal or not, that just gave me something, a sort of controlled, a tightly controlled person who is trying, in a way, despite their own configuration as a person, to be this thing that they are trying so hard to be, and then they come up against that. But I find that one of the sort of good tensions that lives in the middle of it.
And that's like, it's hard to really pinpoint so much of what resonates for people like myself and countless others, right? For me, I empathize with a lot of what he's doing as, a 42-year-old man with my own issues and whatever, right? And when in the finale of season 1, Kendall retreats into himself as his father has kind of won that tug of war, I don't think a moment like that has really resonated with me for a very long time. And maybe I need years of therapy to understand why. But I would like to know from you, as the guy who actually did the scene, how it impacted on you to do that, because it really was such a great climax to season 1.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you. It felt like a real test for me as an actor. I've committed my life to doing this work, and it's been the thing that I've cared about most of all my whole life. And that scene, in a way, was sort of the, it's like it's a kind of chance to be, held in the balance and found wanting as an actor. So those scenes are always very daunting to approach. And, the work that has most impacted me is usually work where an actor is not acting at all and not performing anything, but having some kind of real experience. And I guess and you try rigorously to hold yourself to that as an actor. But that was one of those scenes where, honestly, I don't know the answer. I had no sort of prescribed notions of what might happen in that scene. There was nothing in the writing that called for any kind of emotional experience in that scene. It was just one of those kind of experiences where you align with the character, I guess, in a way that felt almost, I hate to use the word, but spiritual to me. It felt, I'm going to say another quote, but it's only because these things really are a part of, I think, how I understand working. But I remember as we were getting close to those episodes, I was reading a book about the shadow, because, Kendall and his addiction and his sort of, where do, as an addict, where do you place that aspect of yourself when you're sober? And it gets channeled into, I think in Kendall's case, a need for power and control. But I was reading this book about the shadow, and this writer said something about how the growth experience happens when you come to the point of insolubility where you feel that you can proceed no further. And I think the greatest writing, in the greatest stories and in literature, take a character to that point, to this sort of Gordian knot in themselves, where you can't go any further than that. And you don't know how you're going to untangle it or resolve it. Mm-hmm. And I think as an actor, I had to submit myself to that. And I had a very personal and very, I guess, cathartic experience. I think it did feel therapeutic. It did feel, I had a belief reading the show and talking to Jesse about the arc of the season and where it needed to go. In a sense, that season, as well as this last season, hinged on the final scene. It was as if the whole season was leading up to this, this final moment, being able to rotate in some radical way and reveal something that has been there all along, but that you've not tipped the hat of for the audience. And I guess I felt like the armature of this character, which he is presented and sort of hidden behind, needed to kind of, it needed to be cracked and pierced, and you needed to see and feel the sort of wounded child inside. So I guess I feel like it was one of those kind of miraculous times as an actor where you feel like you, by some power other than yourself, have an experience that then gets transmitted to the audience. So, I don't understand. I don't understand what went into that scene or how it happened. But you're living in the skin of that character for so long, and and Jesse has pressurized and tightened the noose, and there are so many things that are kind of pulling this character apart, that I felt when I came to the end of that season and going through the harrowing experience of what happened in the lake, and filming that stuff, and and believing in it utterly. I just felt something collapsed inside me, and also was released. So it was a real release. And then the second season was such a kind of entirely different pivot.
Yeah.
From that.
Yeah, and then he spends so much of the second season downtrodden and wary of his toxic father. But then it ends so enormously satisfying with the shocker. But Kendall once again betrays his father, but this time it's in public, where he's really saying, Dad, you are effectively a corrupt criminal co-conspirator. Take us back to shooting that scene, because I spoke to Brian Cox about it a few months ago, and he talked me through the smirk that he gives the TV at the end, which I loved. But your part is so wonderful because for me, it was another catharsis, but a different one.
Yeah, I mean, for me too, it was incredibly difficult to sort of hold myself in a way like trapped under a sheet of ice for the whole season. Downtrodden is right, but I also think it was more extreme than that. I think you had to feel that this was literally the shell of a person who is broken inside, in a way that might never mend, sort of irreparably broken by what he's done, and whatever ethical core he had as a person has, it's sort of just moral rot has kind of taken over, and he's separated from everyone, from his family and from the world, by this sort of unbridgeable divide because of what he's done, and he's haunted by it. And I think his way of coping with that is just to shut down. So he's this sort of, there's an almost kind of robotic, Jesse talked about the Manchurian Candidate and this idea of a sort of almost lobotomized, weaponized, but so that being said, so it was everything that was active in Kendall in season 1 sort of went dark, and the engine fell out, and so trying to live in that place was hard. And so when I got to a point finally where I could get out of that place, felt incredibly freeing, and I didn't know, I knew that scene was going to happen. Jesse and I always talk about the sort of architecture of a season so that I can try and sort of construct it in a way in the work. But that scene for me, it felt like, the sort of precursor to that scene is really the scene with he and I in his bedroom on the boat, when when I see, I think for the first time, the sort of Gorgon head behind him, this sort of monstrous cruelty that I think until that point I had willfully, willfully blinded myself to, because I needed to believe in him, and sort of, but when he says, when he uses the phrase "no real person involved," tying it to the caterer waiter, that was a moment, if I'd been sort of screaming inside the whole season, that was a moment where everything went deadly quiet, and and there's
as you speak, because I can, it brings back this visceral reaction. Not that it shows that, like, that's
the power of the writing. I really do think it's the power of the writing, and that was a moment in particular that Jesse and I have a. I'm sort of the luckiest actor in the world to have, what is both the role of a lifetime, but also a writer collaborator who is incredibly open, and I, when I got the first draft, I wrote to Jesse because in the first draft, all that was there was my father telling me that I'm not a killer.
That's it. Right.
And while I felt that is, of course, a catalyst, that's also something that he says to me in the first episode of the first season, essentially. So that dynamic is there already. And it felt like, you know, that the trigger was there and the firing pin was there, but we needed a hammer. And there were subsequent revisions, and then some new pages came in where I think Jesse woke up at 3 a.m. and had one of those sort of epiphanies where he tied those two things together, and it just made everything coalesce in this terrible way for me. And in a way, it made me think of all my sons, you know, that moment where the son finds out that his father was complicit and knew about the faulty airplane parts. And once I see that, I can't unsee that. And that changes everything. And so in that moment, I think the fire that had been extinguished and the light that had been extinguished, the fire sort of comes roaring back to life in my belly. And then it was quite easy from then on to do what I had to do, because, you know, it was a sort of phoenix from the ashes kind of thing. The shooting of the scene proved surprisingly difficult. You know, it was one of those scenes that felt like, oh, in the table read, this feels kind of in the pocket, and, you know, I know what it is, and we're just going to show up and do a few takes, and that'll be that. Because often, you know, I don't like to rehearse, and usually you sort of have the experience of the scene and make those discoveries kind of, you know,
yeah,
I find, you know, right off the bat, if you're prepared enough. But with that scene, for some reason, it was very, very elusive. And for me, it only clicked, I think we were on take 12 or 13, and I put a sort of caesura between the word but and the rest of the speech, where everything sort of hung in the air. And for some reason, that was just a sort of, you know, accident. But everything kind of came from that. And that speaks to, I guess, the environment, the work environment that we're in, where it's so permissive and they allow you to take risks and try things. And, you know, I think I tore up the paper, the letter at the end of that take, and that was something that they used. But no, it's an exquisite scene. And this show and this role, you know, it's like I get to travel. All you want as an actor is to feel wrung out completely by a role and feel like you've just left everything in the ring. So while you know, and to give everything. So I feel sort of very spent by, you know, when I get to the end of it and like there's nowhere left to go and nothing left to offer. I am at this point ready and excited to go back for another round.
Yeah, and we are desperately waiting for that too. Unfortunately, we're on a bit of a break. We all are. We're all staying home, but things will go back to normal, and then season 3 will be shot, and then we will see it. And Jeremy, I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to it, and I can't tell you how thankful I am for your time today. And
thank you, Rob. Thanks, man. It's so nice to talk to you, and stay well.
You too. Now, everybody, while you're here, go to goalsabby.com, make your predictions, and click subscribe. We have lots of chats with lots of contenders just like Jeremy.